Hello and welcome to Introductory Biology. Now with biology, we always start with the characteristics of life. So it doesn't matter if you're in the Bio 100 class or if you go further into a 200, 300, or even into some graduate work. One of the things you'll notice is that in biology, we keep coming back and revisiting this concept of the characteristics of life. And part of that makes sense considering that biology is a study of life. So of course you would come back and keep revisiting your underlying assumptions, your underlying premise of how you are defining whether something is currently living, whether something was once living, like this puffer fish right here, or this dragonfly that was once alive, whether something was produced by something living, like these freshwater mussel shells, this jawbone, the crawdad claw, or these antlers, and even our young deer skull here. So these we know now were produced by something living. And our plant here we know is currently living, and I'll get into that here in a little bit as to why we know this is currently living, and these things are not currently living. And then, of course, the things that were never alive, that have never been alive, and definitely will not demonstrate those characteristics of life. So we always come back and look at these characteristics of life. How are we defining life on our planet? What are we looking for when we are looking for things that are living, produced by once living, or were once alive? So we take a look at different things that we might discover in our environment. When something is living, we are looking for it to demonstrate, very obviously, those main characteristics of life. So one characteristic of life, the characteristic of life that living things will sense and respond to things in their environment. Now clearly I can poke and prod all the things on this table and none of them will scream at me. None of them will show response to my stimuli. Even if I start to touch this plant, it's not going to show me directly that it's responding to my touch. But as we now know from current research, that when I start to pinch and touch these leaves, each individual cell is sending a signal that moves throughout the rest of this plant. So it is sensing and responding to my stimuli. Now, the other thing that I can notice about this plant is definitely sensing and responding to a different stimuli other than touch. It's responding to sunlight. It should be growing straight up, but as you can see, it's got this very steep lean. What it is doing is it's bending towards the light, something called phototropism. Photo means light, and tropism is movement. So it's reaching and stretching and trying to get to the light. Sunlight, of course, is its main food source, and as we're going to study in Chapter 6, we're going to get into the details of how this voodoo lily plant is able to take that sunlight and turn it into sugars like glucose. We're going to get into the details of photosynthesis. So essentially it is stretching and reaching out, trying to grab all of the food, trying to grab the sunlight. So in this bending, we say that sensing and responding to stimuli, and it's also obtaining and using energy. It is demonstrating to us that it is an autotroph. So that's two of our characteristics of life. Another characteristic of life that we're going to look for is we're going to look for living things to grow. So I will come back and make observations of this voodoo lily. It should get about this tall by the end of the summer. At the end of the summer, this leaf will fall off. In the ground is the stem, and this plant will go dormant. Somewhere in the winter, around January, February, it will start to send up a flower, and that flower is going to smell like decomposing flesh. The flower, of course, is not here for my enjoyment. The flower is here to attract flies. In the process of attracting flies, the flies are going to help this plant to be able to reproduce. And when we talk about reproduction, another characteristic of life, we're going to be looking for plants to make genetically new combinations of themselves. Now, this plant is made of eukaryotic cells, and so in order for it to make genetically new combinations, it's first going to have to go through that complicated process of cell division called meiosis to make the gametes, the sperm and the egg, and we'll talk about that process in Chapter 9. But it's not enough just to make the sperm and the egg. The plant needs the sperm and the egg to come together through fertilization in order to make the diploid zygote, to make the kids, to make the offspring, the babies, the next generation. That next generation has the genetically new combinations. Now, in those genetically new combinations, we're going to look to see if things change. Maybe the kid, the offspring, that diploid zygote, the next generation, has a gene that creates an adaptation that allows this voodoo lily to survive when the environment changes. So when we talk about living things evolving, another characteristic of life, we're looking at those changes in the DNA, changes in the line of descent over time. We're looking for similarities and differences from one generation to the next, and we're looking for when those things called speciation happen. When we have that splitting of one species into two or more new species that can no longer breed, can no longer make genetically new combinations with each other. They can only do it within their own population, within their own individuals of the same species. So our plant is demonstrating a lot of our characteristics of life. Living things evolve, they obtain and use energy, they respond to stimuli, they reproduce, they grow. It's a eukaryotic celled organism, so it's doing the cell division process called mitosis, where one cell makes two genetically identical cells. Now, inside of each individual cell, the cells are maintaining homeostasis. Now, when the textbook and when things like dictionary.com define something like homeostasis, they're using this it sounds scientific, it sounds so like official. Homeostasis is the maintenance of an internal environment. Now, that doesn't actually tell me anything. That doesn't communicate a whole lot of information. So when I think of homeostasis, I think of it as maintaining your systems within thresholds. Cells and bodies, they all have multiple different systems. And really, the only thing that we're concerned about is where those limits are, where the constraints are, where those thresholds are. Because when you cross a threshold, that's when we get damage. And a lot of times that damage cannot be repaired. It can be catastrophic damage. It could lead to the death of the entire entity. So when it comes to homeostasis, it's an underlying assumption that living things are going to want to maintain all of those systems within those constraints, within those thresholds, and that those constraints and thresholds are then going to define where and how much and how this living entity is going to essentially have its little life. So our plant each individual cell is maintaining homeostasis, which allows the entire voodoo lily plant to maintain homeostasis. I want to end with that last characteristic of life, that living things are organized. This, I think, is one of the most important characteristics of life. When we talk about living things being organized, generally in introductory biology, we start at the level of an atom. Atoms bond together to make molecules. Molecules come together to make a cell. The cell is the smallest unit of life. Cells come together and bond and communicate with one another to make tissues. Tissues work together to make this discrete entity called an organ. All of the organs start to work together, communicating with one another to make an organ system. And all of the organ systems inside of this discrete unit is an organism. We go above that to the population level, the community level. We get to the ecosystem and the biosphere, which is all of the ecosystems on the planet interacting and communicating with one another. Now, the reason why I think that this characteristic of life is so important is that when I'm making observations, when I'm trying to understand the world around me, when I'm trying to explain things, most importantly, when I'm trying to find solutions to problems, I have to keep coming back to the way how living things are organized, that very strict hierarchy. Because one of the things that I can do, and what many scientists and people can do, is we can make a mistake at trying to oversimplify something, trying to explain something or solve a problem at the wrong level of analysis, or not understanding that we have to bounce between all of those scales in our hierarchy. I think this characteristic of life, how living things are organized, is very, very helpful, especially when we're looking at or our understanding of life is being challenged. So when we look at the study of viruses, when viruses were first being discovered, there was this challenge to our definition or our understanding of what it means for something to be alive or to be living. And as we learn more about viruses, it's very clear that viruses are not living if we're using that strict definition or strict application of the characteristics of life. Viruses are essentially these little protein capsules with some information inside. The information is usually in the form of either DNA or RNA molecules. When it comes to viruses, viruses can't survive on their own. They go into what we call a dormant state, but they can't maintain homeostasis. They definitely can't reproduce without a cell. They can't make genetically new combinations without a living cell doing that for them. They definitely can't grow without a cell helping them to be able to grow. So when we look at the SARS-CoV-2 virus, that is just a protein capsule with some RNA inside. When that virus gets inside of our lungs, what that virus does is it infects a cell. When it infects that cell essentially is going to die. It's going to take the virus in, read the RNA. When it reads that RNA, it's going to make more viruses. It's going to release those viruses, and once it releases the viruses, the cell is no longer going to function. Now, those viruses that have just been released will infect new cells. Those cells will take in the virus, read the RNA, make more virus. So our SARS-CoV-2 virus needs to have, or coronavirus 2, needs to have cells in order to make more of itself. In that process of being brought into a lung cell, the virus could get some mutations in the RNA. So those new viruses that are produced may be different than the original virus. There may be some mutations inside. So those genetically new combinations again occurred when the virus infected that living cell. So when we look at this characteristic of life, that living things are organized, this is going to help us to understand why contracting the coronavirus can be so damaging and so quickly lead to catastrophic whole system, whole organism failure. When that one cell that was infected dies, that's not a big deal. But if lots of cells inside of our lungs start to die, then that means the tissue can no longer function. If the tissue can't function, the whole organ of a lung cannot function. And think about the purpose of our lung. Our lung needs to bring in oxygen. That oxygen goes to all of the organs inside of our body. So when our lungs get damaged and they're not effectively bringing in oxygen, the other cells in the other tissues, in the other organs in our body will start to experience damage. We get enough damage and enough tissues and enough organs, now we're looking at that really, really serious, heartbreaking situation of whole system failure and potentially the individual no longer being able to survive. So a little non-living entity, and it is so tiny compared to the size of a cell, that little non-living entity has the possibility to cause huge effects on life. But if we use that strict definition, our strict application of our characteristics of life, a virus doesn't need several of those. And so this is why we get to say that a virus is non-living. And it's through using that characteristic of life, how living things are organized, that helps us to understand how the virus can cause such damage. And then we can understand all of those ripple effects, because that person was part of a population. They were part of a family. They were part of a friendship circle. They had a work environment. They had some kind of contribution to our society. So when that individual is affected, there are ripple effects through those larger systems. And yes, ripple effects through the entire biosphere. So our characteristics of life, we come back and we keep revisiting them in introductory biology. We keep reminding ourselves of how we define life and how we can use these characteristics of life to understand things, explain things, and most importantly, to be able to solve problems. If you have any questions, if you want to talk about this more, you know when and where to find me, how to contact me, email me, get a hold of me. I love to have these conversations.